Greetings, and a very, very warm welcome to all the participants who have logged in today for continuing our series, the series which is a monthly series dedicated to increasing the awareness regarding passive fire protection. Today's episode is going to focus on procurement pitfalls, or what are the important things to be aware when you're procuring anything related to passive fire protection. Let me begin with some very, very basic rules. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with Zoom, but I would like you to just look at the bottom or top of your screen where you have a toolbar, and please familiarize yourself with the question and answer icon. You would notice that there is a Q&A icon which launches a question and answer window. And I would urge all of you to use this question and answer option to write as many questions as you think are important, critical. It could be related to today's session, but even if it is not related to today's session, but is related to fire protection, passive fire protection, or compliance, I would try to answer these questions. This webinar is recorded, and you would have received a notification of the recording, and hence the recording would be available on our YouTube page. You would also see a poll icon, which is blinking on your screen. And I have a few poll questions set up almost as milestones through the course of today's session. And it would be fantastic if you can answer these poll questions as and when they pop up. I have my colleague Ruben, who is behind the scenes and is supporting me, and he would be launching the poll when it is ready to be launched. And just in the rare case something happens to my laptop and it crashes, or we have a loss of internet, he's going to come in and ask you to wait. Many of you might already be very familiar with me. My name is Abhishek Chabra. I have your host and the presenter for today, and I have been very closely linked with compliance and conformity for almost 2 decades. And I have been talking about increasing awareness and utilization of various means of compliance and conformity across several industries, and more lately with the fire safety in the last decade or so. I'm very active on several platforms, code development, UAE Fire and Life Safety Code, standard development processes. I have a blog of myself called tick.guru, which is aimed at expanding the horizons of understanding of conformity across industries. I see that we have many new faces, so I'm going to do a quick background about the company I represent. I represent a company which is now in its 27th year, or we've completed 26 years. And we are now, we started off 25 years ago as a curtain wall testing laboratory where subcontractors would come and build mock-ups of their curtain wall systems in our lab. And we would test them for air, water, infiltration, and weather behavior. A little over a decade ago, we added capacity and capability to do fire tests, starting off with a fire resistance furnace, which was a 3 meter by 3 meter furnace at that time, and some reaction to fire tests as per the American standards, the ASTM E84, the standard tunnel. Over the last 7-8 years, we have grown in many directions. We expanded our facility to add a large number of tests, all focused at testing and validating passive fire protection and passive fire properties of materials. This includes 3 additional furnaces. So we have 4 furnaces now, a large number of fire propagation tests for cladding, reaction to fire tests for materials, as well as we became a certification body 5 years ago, and our certification and listing program is currently supporting an extremely large number of projects, project consultants, contractors, as well as developers, authorities having jurisdiction to ensure that the products and materials that are procured, that are installed on the projects will be complying to the promise of fire safety. So today, back to fire protection and passive fire protection, as there are an extremely large number of new faces, people from across several time zones, a lot of people from UK, Europe, a lot of people from India, and I'm going to do a small recap about what is passive fire protection and why are we having this series. We're all kind of familiar with the fact that there will be, and there are often, small accidents which could probably trigger a big fire incident. And we need to prepare ourselves to make sure that these small fire incidents do not become a big fire accident. But this preparation and implementation needs to be done across a very broad spectrum of timelines, right from the phase where a developer, a government, a building owner dreams up of a establishment, a building, any kind of occupancy, and right through the process of construction, while the construction is happening, while the internal furnishing is being done, fit out work is being done, and even after occupation, when there is maintenance work being done, and all through this process, we need to make sure that various aspects related to ensuring fire safety are put in the right place, as well as maintained throughout the course of operation. So I'm going to give a background of what is this fire protection as concepts. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but a quick rundown. You can see a small video running on the top left of the screen, which is showing that in case there is a fire that starts inside a house, and how this fire could potentially spread across the house. And you can imagine this floor or this house to be an office floor, a mall, a hospital, and any of the several types of occupancies that we see around us. So how do we make sure that such a fire does not spread? And there have been two means or strategies of fire protection that have been used for with what is called active fire protection, which means all those components, products, and materials that would come into action and activate the moment there is a fire or smoke. This includes smoke detectors, sprinklers, annunciators, and several electromechanical products and systems that would come into action to make sure that fire does not spread. On the other hand, and in parallel, there is another fire protection concept that continues to be used, which is called passive fire protection. And what is passive fire protection? Passive fire protection is a means which is the inherent property of certain materials, no electromechanical, no other means required to bring these fire protection concepts into activation. It is the inherent property of material which will bring forward means to ensure that life and property gets saved. How does this happen? There is a concept of resistance to fire, often talked and discussed in several grounds. What we try to achieve is that we try to achieve containment or compartmentalization, which means if there is a fire that gets initiated at any part, any section of a office or a floor, then this section should be contained for the fire. There are several products and materials that are used to ensure that such a fire does not spread. So in order to bring about containment, we make sure that walls, doors, partition elements are able to limit and contain the fire within itself. There is also the property of reaction to fire, which means carpets, internal finishing, and several such materials which could propagate the fire are limited for ignition or spread of flame or spread of smoke. There is also structural fire resistance, and it is a subject that has been covered in detail. With this, almost as a background or an overview of what is passive fire protection, I'm going to bring forward almost like a list of topics that I have discussed in the past. And if any of the listeners are interested in knowing more about the details of many such subjects, on your screen, you can see that there are sessions which have been recorded in the past, which talk about facade fire safety. I have covered this all through the last 1.5 year in the passive fire series that we started in April last year. We talked about compliance, a good discussion related to fire doors, and a session on inspection and maintenance of passive fire protection. We also focused on the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code, which is where we are based as a laboratory. And we also touched up in the past about how specifications and contracts should be focused at. If any of the listeners are interested in viewing these past recordings, you can bookmark the link and some of the questions in the Q&A, how to access these recordings. You can scan this QR code and it will lead you to a link directly on our YouTube playlist where all these recordings can be accessed. You could also, of course, search us on YouTube and you can access these or the current list of monthly webinars that are addressing some of the very pertinent issues related to passive fire protection. We are currently on the 6th episode of the second series, and this series has taken a much deep dive approach into specific subjects, specific test methods. We started off with the new BS 8414 test, which was released last year in April, as this is the standard that has been adopted for ensuring compliance to facade fires. We talked in great detail about the test methods that are available to test fire resistance of perimeter fire barriers. A specific and a very good session that we did about means of compliance and code and conformity requirements in UAE, as well as the evolving codes and compliance requirements in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, considering that they have recently adopted a new building code on the lines of ICC, the International Code Council's International Building Code. And the last two sessions, which were good deep down focus on explaining what is exactly fire resistance and compartmentalization, and what are the tests that are available around the world and used to validate fire resistance. And then last month, the previous last episode, we covered reaction to fire testing. I hope listeners who are interested to look back on these series have been able to scan the QR code on your screens. And I'm going to take a 5-second break and open a poll question for all of you to get a better understanding of what I should focus on today and what I should spend less time on. Ruben, if you can open the poll question. It is absolutely bliss to look at so many familiar faces and so many new faces who have joined us today in our monthly program. All of you are most welcome to type up questions, anything you feel is pertinent, or any burning question relating to passive fire protection or compliance related to passive fire protection is welcome. And towards the end of today's session, I'm going to try and answer as many questions as the time permits. And any of you who have joined us for the first time, these are monthly sessions which are aimed at helping listeners expand their understanding of compliance as well as passive fire protection. We also run a similar monthly program in Arabic, which is focused on the Saudi Building Code and increasing awareness regarding the various sections of the Saudi Building Code. I'm going to give a few more seconds for the listeners to quickly punch in their answers, and then Ruben can share the result of the poll. So a good set of answers. I see a kind of a nice split between people favoring active fire or not favoring active fire. And let's move on today's session. We'll talk about what are the risks and what these risks mean throughout the course of implementing fire safety, right from the time when we dream up of a city, dream up of a building, dream up of an occupancy type, and right till the time that we occupy or modify these occupancies. There are, of course, a large number of risks, and I'm going to today focus at one specific risk, which is the risk related to what are you procuring. Whenever we are implementing any risk mitigation measures, at this time, we are talking about fire protection, fire safety, and specifically matters related to passive fire protection. Now, the challenge is, and this happens across several segments, that what you are trying to procure versus what you would eventually get may not exactly be the same. And this often calls for several tools of assurance and various mechanisms which lead to a better assurance of what you're procuring. I'm going to touch up upon specific tools of assurance, which is certification and listing, as well as inspections, and how these can come in handy to ensure fire protection. But let me ask you a question. How many of you have done some online shopping in the recent times? I'm not sure how many, but I can guarantee that some of you would have had big disappointments. And these disappointments have been happening and continue to happen in the retail industry. And it's relatively easy to take care of these disappointments. You take a photograph, you post it on social media, or you ask the online retailer to take the product back and give you the money back. This somehow is not possible for many other types of industries. You would agree with me that once a product is procured or installed inside a building, it is almost impossible to do what is called a product recall. And hence, it becomes super critical that the means of assurance and all the mechanisms related to assurance are in place. I'm going to give a brief overview of how these assurance mechanisms have evolved over the years. People who've been doing business for the last 20, 30, 40 years would be familiar with a time and an era where an ISO 9000 certification of a business or an entity used to provide the base level of assurance. If you wanted to do business, you should have an ISO 9001. And this audit of the manufacturer, seller, buyer, or any commercial entity provided a means of assurance that the commercial entity has some or the other method by which they are ensuring all the processes, right from procurement to quality control to sales, have a certain method around it. They can be audited, and there exists documented evidence about traceability. But was this enough to ensure that the products and materials being procured will come up to the expectations? Not so much. And this led to the next level of means and mechanisms. People wanted test reports. People wanted to test products and materials that are delivered to ensure that they are able to demonstrate the properties which are being promised. These properties were across the bandwidth. It was mechanical properties, structural properties, chemical behavior, uh, life cycle analysis, and of course, properties related to fire safety. And today, we're going to focus more in understanding that the specific properties of passive fire protection, which need assurance, what are the mechanisms available to make sure these are there. The concept of certification and listing is something that some of you might already be familiar with. You may have seen certification marks or logos on products, and these certification programs, often run by government bodies or private companies, provide a very high degree of assurance between the buyer and the seller about the properties of materials that are being procured. We will talk in a much greater detail about what these properties are and what are these mechanisms actually that ensure that the properties will be as they are advertised. So I'm going to run a small exercise with all of you. And before we run this small exercise and before we enter into a detailed section of today's webinar, I'm going to ask my colleague to run this short poll again. Ruben, if you're around. Many of you might be familiar with some or the other certification mark. I'm not very sure. I want to understand where the audience is, because depending on your general experience, I'm going to run a small exercise with all of you. And I'll give you a few seconds to quickly try and complete this poll question. I think Ruben is not going to close the poll till we have everybody's attendance in place. So I would request you all to quickly answer the questions, and then we can move towards an interesting exercise that is lined up. That's very, very nice. We have a good percentage of people in the audience who have witnessed manufacturing, and you have seen certification logos. So let's move forward. I'm going to run you through processes which are followed by certification bodies to ensure that the product which is delivered in the market is able to demonstrate the products. Now, I want all of you to imagine any one of the products on your screen, and imagine yourself as an entity or a person who needs to come up with a mechanism to ensure that the manufacturing process will be exactly the same, and what products, whichever one you pick up, it could be a sealant, it could be aluminum composite panel, it could be an insulation material, that this factory you are auditing, and you are taking the ownership or assurance. How would you do this? So I'm going to detail 5-6 steps. These 5 steps are the basic steps which are defined in a guideline document. The guideline document is the ISO 17067. This guideline document gives an idea to certification bodies to come up with a construct, a system that will ensure that they can give a third-party assurance. So whether these are certification programs run by government entities, for example, in India, you have the Bureau of Indian Standards issuing an ISI mark, or the ECAS mark in Emirates, or any of several privately run certification programs like the one from us as Thomas Bell-Wright International Consultants, or big international companies like UL or FM or Intertech or Warrington, and the list goes on and on. All of these certification bodies would have come up with a construct. And this construct, this scheme, this certification program allows I'm sorry, I'm getting a message that I am not audible. Can someone confirm to me that I am audible or not? All right, so I want all of you to imagine certification body. And the certification program starts with establishing some or the other form of traceability. It starts with a sample selection, which means that wherever the manufacturing is happening, whether it is a sealant or an insulation product, imagine being there and imagine trying to analyze how different batches of production are done, how different product which exists in the factory, how are they produced, and how you as an auditor would go there and select one product and say, yes, I have noticed and I understand the whole process of how this specific product is manufactured, right from the place where the raw materials are coming in. It runs through various processes, and the end product is either packed in a box or rolled out or packed in a big crate with certain markings and traceability of either batch number or any other. Once this sample has been selected, there are various mechanisms that are put in place to determine the specific characteristic that you will give an assurance for. So let us imagine that we are talking about ignitability of certain material that you chose, or resistance to fire, or reaction to fire. And these properties are then tested. So you picked up a sample, you witnessed the manufacturing process of this sample. Let this sample go to a laboratory and let's test this. Let us see what is the test result. And there could be several mechanisms to do this, but the best that is the most reliable often for a specific product is to do a test. The test could pass, the test could fail. If the test fails, you may have to go back to the factory and say, listen, you have to change your recipe, you have to change the mechanism, you have to change some aspect that will ensure that the product that you manufacture now, again in front of you, is better than the previous one. So let us assume through various iterations, the product passes a specific test, which was validation of either ignitability or fire resistance or reaction to fire or any of the properties that you are giving assurance for. Now you add up the evidence to say, yes, the manufacturer is following a given process, which I have recorded, and you have evidence of testing in front of you. At this point of time, you may want to go back to the factory and make sure that they have a quality procedure in place to make sure they are able to demonstrate repeatability of production. Because at any manufacturing location, there could be a few dozen or a few hundred different products that are manufactured. You could be giving an assurance for one or a few. And how these are manufactured, what are the processes, you have to audit. Once you audit these processes, you could allow them a use of a certification mark. You could allow them with a piece of paper which says, I think you comply with the standard method, and your product, whenever you manufacture in the future, is going to comply to these standards or these performances. And hence, there could be one of several ways in which you could give this assurance saying, well, I have witnessed the initial manufacturing process. I have witnessed the result of the test, and I have audited that there is a mechanism in place to make sure that the product that is being produced regularly is being produced exactly in the same way like the initial sample which I tested and I witnessed is being manufactured. Now, having gone through these steps, I must share with you that these are what you see on your screen, general guidelines, which means that you could write a certification program which may not be very, very stringent. You could write a certification program which allows a much lower form of assurance. There are certification programs which need not establish this level of traceability. You could say, well, the manufacturing processes are maintained properly. So whatever they produce, they are able to reproduce in the same way if they want to. And hence, we feel they are a good manufacturer. And hence, there exist many different tiers or types of certification program. And you may probably be familiar with the fact that there are some compliance programs which end up being very, very stringent. Many of you answered the poll question that you are familiar with some of the certification marks that exist on electrical products. Many of these certification marks, which are mandatory and have a potential punishment in your country, follow very, very stringent measures and hence would have mechanisms like A third-party body could pick up a sample from the market, conduct a test on it, or there is a recurring audit in the factory to make sure that a sample is picked up and assurance is attained. Now, across this spectrum of various mechanisms which are available for third-party certification is where the choice often becomes difficult. In the course of the construction industry, there are requirements that are set in place. These requirements could be from the building codes, which are having some or the other level of enforcement. These requirements could be from specifications or contracts. These requirements could be just outright reputation linked, that I don't want my reputation going back, so I want the highest level of assurance. In some countries, some products have a regulation in place. The law of a country, the law of a jurisdiction, or outright legal requirement, which is having a punishment against it. Punishment could be fine or any other kinds from the state or from the government, could mandate compliance of certain levels. And here we talk about conformity. And you would realize and notice that there are very, very few products where governments intervene and governments come into the space and say, you cannot sell a product which is not complying to a certain requirement. And this very rarely exists for fire safety products in the construction industry across the world. And this is the reason why the private certification marks and programs are what are chosen by authorities, by contractors, by developers to ensure that the products that are procured are complying to requirements. Let's take a quick example of some of the products. Fire doors, many of you are familiar with, are providing the compartmentalization. And what is a fire door? A fire door is a system or not one product, but is an assembly of several products. It is a fire door assembly. Whether it is a metal door or a wooden door, it has several components. So now if you close your eyes and imagine back to the factory that you had gone to, imagine all of these components coming from various vendors and suppliers and the level of a quality procedure that needs to be in place. You would very easily be able to imagine the scale of organization who would be able to maintain such stringent procedures and who may not be able to. So when you go back and say, let me pick up a sample and test a fire door in the laboratory, and you could end up getting a test report, and this test report could show that the product, the fire door which was tested, is complying to a given requirement, which could be 60 minutes, 120 minutes or so. And this is where I would urge all of you to just imagine, thinking back to the factory that you just audited in your minds, that how difficult it may be to reproduce such doors if the factory is not audited by a third party. So let's take an example how this happens in the real world. There is hopefully a fire and life safety plan of a type of occupancy. Let us imagine a hotel or a hospital where, as a result of the fire and life safety plan, you have a door schedule. A door schedule which would list 500 doors, 300 doors, 200 doors, or 5,000 doors, depending on the scale of the project. And based on this door schedule, the contractor is going to bid and say, who is the door supplier who can supply these 500 doors, and what is the means of assurance that is available that all these 500 doors will comply to fire resistance, keeping in mind all the possible variables that exist during the manufacturing process. And this is the reason why not just the certification and listing, which becomes a prime means of assurance, there is the need of some level of assessment, because a manufacturer may only have evidence of proof of testing and getting certified maybe a few types of fire doors, but not the ones which are needed for a given project. And hence, assessments or retests are very, very critical to bring about this assurance. As explained, that this testing and certification process often ends up in what is called as a certification and listing, which means that the manufacturer gets an authorization to put a mark, a certification number, and this certification number can be traced back in an open domain. The buyer of a certified and listed product can go to the certification directory and look up that what the manufacturer is claiming and is visible on the certification number or the logo or the traceability mark which is printed on the product. What is the product? Where is it coming from? What is the manufacturing location? As an example, if it is a fire door which has been certified, what does the fire door look like? What are the details of this fire door that are available for you as a third-party inspector or even the contractor who has procured this door for the purpose of assuring compartmentalization. This product certification, which let's say is available on the certification directory, all the data that is available, this data is enough and more data for you as the buyer or an authority having jurisdiction to go back and go to the construction site and check, is this the door that is certified or is it something else? This, I feel, is a very, very critical step which often gets missed out. And in case you are spending a good amount of money to ensure fire safety and you are not following processes in place to make sure what you're procuring is really what is being asked for by using a third-party certification as a tool or a mechanism, then you might just be wasting some money. And the compartmentalization or the basic concept of fire safety requires not just a fire door, but an extremely large number of components and elements ranging from walls, through penetrations, and so many other things that are very, very important to be checked. Case in example, a lot of you people are familiar with the fact that the moment compartmentalization is done, you have the walls and doors fit in place. The MEP guys come in because they need to get the utilities in, which means the compartmentalization is broken in. And after the utilities are brought back in, there is the need to do fire stopping. You need to recreate all the compartmentalization that was created using the doors, walls, false ceilings, and so on and so forth. And in case all of these systems, which are brought back in place, are not specified correctly, then it is extremely, extremely impossible for getting that level of assurance. And hence there is a need that we do not just rely on the minimum norms set in by the government. The specification documents are very, very clear. We don't just ask for a test report, which could be a test report of a few years ago of a product that might not even reach your construction site. You need to ask for conformity with right details. The technical specification document should say that the product has to be listed by a certification body, which is accredited. It should set in the responsibility. Who is responsible in case the conformity is not in place. What is the evidence that needs to be submitted? There has to be a listing report. Who will inspect? Is the inspector qualified to do these inspections? And the most important, which I feel, is that all compliances and quality related aspects should link with some stage payment. If you have these things in place, then you have a commercially secure contract that will enable quality assurance, that will enable better implementation of fire safety. There are several published standards which are available and guide how to validate passive fire protection after it is procured. There are standards on inspection of fire doors, which define how to check whether the fire doors are actually certified, whether the fire doors are going to comply to the requirements of a given project. And these requirements of inspection go across all passive fire protection implementation, whether it's fire stopping, through penetration, perimeter fire barriers, and so on and so forth. And with this very, very quick kind of overview of various mechanisms that are available, right from third-party certification to inspection to ensuring that the products that you procure and use, I'm going to lead you to the last slide with a poll question, and I'm going to start welcoming question and answers for today's session. I would urge anybody who wants to send any questions my way that these questions should be sent in the question and answer window, because the questions which are written in the chat window, I may not have record. And if I miss out these questions, I may not be able to answer these questions at a later date. We have a few minutes for answering some of the questions, and please feel free to type out these questions in the question and answer chat window. Not the chat window, but question and answer window. All right, so I have a few questions which are already coming in. I'm going to read these questions and I will try and answer them. Let me start with the first one. Which passive fire protection in high-rise buildings? Santosh, if you could be clear on explaining what the question is again, it would be very, very helpful. But yes, if I try to answer this question, there are many measures and means for passive fire protection in high-rise buildings. And it starts with basically the compartmentalization depending on the occupancy type. So whether it's a residential building, it's a commercial building, in which zone or which country the building exists, and what are the requirements that may already be set in place by the local fire authority in terms of fire rating, or how much time it would take to evacuate. These parameters lead to what is the compartmentalization requirement, 1 hour rated, 2 hour rated, or so on and so forth. I hope that kind of answers your question, but please feel free to ask the question with greater clarity if required. The second question is, would like to view these recorded. Okay, I've answered this. The recording is available on YouTube. What are the basis for test protocol? Are they referred from American standards or European standards? So the testing methodologies are several. There are American standards that are published and are available for testing fire resistance. We are accredited to offer these tests. There are European standards, and also there are some other country level requirements like standards which are published in France, standards which are published in South Africa, standards which are published in India or New Zealand. Very often, some countries like to publish their own standards which are driven by local or regional requirements. So yes, there are several standards which are available. Another interesting question comes very often. How do we know if a particular certification has been withdrawn or not? Any certification issued to any product should ideally have the traceability of that certification printed or available in some form on the product. And they would have a unique traceability number or certification number. This certification number has to be listed in a public directory, and you can at any point of time check whether the certificate is valid or has been withdrawn. I would welcome you to look up tbwcert.com, and when you search for certain certificates or certain types of products like fire rated doors as per the UL standards or the British standards or the EN standards, you will notice that some certificates have been withdrawn or suspended because either the manufacturer has not faced the audits or is not very sure of producing those products in the future. There are a lot of anonymous questions. I would love to see the questions from people. There is a question related to asking for 3 hours fire rating of fire doors may be applicable in UAE, but in India, as per NBC 2026, it is 2 hours. Whatever is the rating that is mandated by an authority having jurisdiction, I feel it is very, very important that it gets implemented correctly. So as a buyer of a fire door or any passive fire protection strategies implementation, it is important that there is some level of assurance that is available. As a contractor or as the building owner, you need to rely on an assurance mechanism that works. All right. Can Thomas Bell-Wright produce an ASTM as well as an EN standard certification in a single testing furnace? This is dependent on the type of product that we are talking of. In some products, doing this is relatively easy, but is something that we have not done in the past. So Abbas, I get your question, and we can get in touch and we can discuss a specific product if required. There is a question talking about the how much thickness we require to fill the penetration of a duct opening or a pipe penetration. So Gosul, that's a very interesting question. There is a dedicated session that I did on through penetrations in the past, and you can look this up in as well. But very often the methodology or thickness and several details are listed in the certifications and conformity of through penetrations. I would love to connect with you later if you would want greater clarification. There's another question: if Thomas Bell-Wright have a facility in UAE for all passive fire protection, and I would say that we cover a very, very broad spectrum. I would not like to say all, but almost everything that is codified in the region, we are able to offer a testing or testing and certification as well. Is there a method for systems certification? Yes, there are standards that are published for system certification, which are 9001, 18001, 27000, and depending on the type of systems, there are several systems certification. I'm going to take two more questions, and the balance questions I will have to come back. There is a question saying striking the right balance between passive and active fire protection measures is critical to designing and maintaining safe facility. Inspection and treatment of passive fire protection problems can be a major operation in terms of cost and logistical impacts. How to overcome this? Maintaining any system that is critical to life and fire safety is important. In my personal opinion, a sprinkler system or a smoke detector system could fail and requires a very high degree of maintenance, right from the type of water or electrical connections, etc. And the same level of maintenance and assurance mechanisms are required for passive fire protection. And from all that I have read, seen, and talked to people, it's very, very common that a good passive fire protection system implemented well has been known to protect life almost in the same level that an active fire is. So I feel both the systems are very, very important, and calling that it is too expensive is something which is depending completely on how you value the property or the life. I will take one last question, and the balance questions I will have to come back. So there is a question which says how we may be able to identify a fire rated door during a fire safety audit / inspections that don't have any mark of certification. Is India CBRI under CSIR probably the only certifying body for building materials? So Jay, this is a very good question. And the first part that I know of is that CBRI in India is only a testing laboratory. They do not certify the manufacturer, which means they do not have any link with how the doors which were tested and submitted to them were manufactured. So a test report from CBRI rarely provides a linkage with how doors supplied to the construction project are manufactured. I am aware that CBRI in Roorkee is not accredited, which means there is nobody who audits them as an independent third-party body to check whether they have calibrated instruments or they are interpreting the test method correctly. Having said that, I am not questioning their authority. All I'm saying is they are not third-party audited. One of the two ways by which fire inspectors or fire auditors bring about assurance is you call for certification and listing as part of the contract, and you can look up the certification labels on the fire doors, or as part of the contract, you ensure that the supplier or the subcontractor will test 2 or 3 randomly selected doors in an accredited laboratory. And this is usually not too expensive, laboratories are now available. Lots of laboratories are available. We as a test lab based in Dubai have been supporting many projects in India. And in comparison to the contract value, the cost of testing is not very, very high. With this, I am going to bring an end to today's session. And thank you very, very much for joining us today. And several questions which are unanswered, I'm going to get back to you either in an email or a phone call. Thank you for joining us today. And it has been a wonderful session. I hope many of you enjoyed it and are taking back something interesting from today's session.